Hello, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Wherever you are, English learners, I greet you. May God bless you. Good morning once more. Let us learn together in a given spoken English. It will help you to speak, to practice your daily English fluently. Well, let me talk about back in the time. Back in the time. We are going to take back in the time. I use the to plus in a given verb, but for the time being I don't. Tugiye kuvuga ngo mu gihe cyashize nakundaga gukora ugashyiraho inshinga ariko kuri ubu sinkibikora. Examples here we have back in the time I used it to drink much beer, but for the time being I don't. Back in the time I used it to love many girls, but for the time being I don't. Back in the time I used it to smoke cigarettes, but for the time being I don't. Back in the time I used it to sleep before time, but for the time being I don't. Examples number 2 we have back in the time. Back in the time I used it to call my grandma every Sunday. I'd talk about everything and nothing, but for the time being, I don't. She made the past feel like it was still happening. Back in the time, I used it to call my parents in the night, but for the time being, I don't. Back in the time, I used to play football, but for the time being, I don't. Here we have examples number 3. Back in the time, I used it to read every night, but for the time being, I don't. Or back in the time, I used it to read every night before bed, but for the time being, I don't. The book sit quietly on the shelf waiting. Back in the time, I used it to jog at sunrise, but for the time being, I don't. The shoes are still by the door untouched. Back in the time, I used it to call my best friend every Friday, but for the time being, I don't. Life got busy and the silence grew longer. Back in the time, I used it to skirt phrases in my notebook, but for the time being, I don't. The pencil feels foreign in my hand now. Back in the time, I used to bake on Sundays, but for the time being, I don't. The overstay is called, the response is forgotten. Alright, so we have examples number 4. Back in the time, I used to write letters, real ones, with stamps and envelopes, but for the time being, I don't. Now it's all texts and quick replies. Back in the time, I used it to sing in the shower, but for the time being, I don't. The melodies are stuck somewhere between memory and mood. Back in the time, I used it to help people, but for the time being, I don't. I still care, but I haven't made the time. Back in the time, I used it to dance like no one was watching, but for the time being, I don't. I worry too much about who might be. Back in the time, I used it to believe everything would work out, but for the time being, I don't. Well, so thank you so much, dear guys, to follow me. I wish you the best. May God bless you.